Bill Griffith, who is the curator there. Since we have such a small group tonight, I'm going to invite you all to come up to Oxford and I'll give you a tour, personal family tour, okay? And you can help me to that. So Kathleen and I felt we would do a conversation tonight, just chat about in a casual way about the book, how it came about, and the film, Thinking of Home. So.
Are you ready?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think we have to start at the beginning. How did you and Dean meet?
Dean and I met at the University of Mississippi in 1970. We were in graduate school in the English department. She was working on a master's. I was in the doctoral program. And she came up to me in the hallway in Bondurant Hall. Do you know Miss Bondurant Hall? And said, what is a participle? Now, this is the last thing you would expect to start a romance and a marriage that lasted 38 years. But we had met earlier in Chaucer class, which was taught by Louis Dellerheide. If you've ever heard that name, Louis was at one time the chairman of the English department at Mississippi College, and he met young Barry, took Barry Hannah under his wing, and really taught Barry a lot and got Barry started in literature. But Dean and I met in 1970 in graduate school. We started a study group together. We began to hang out. I was married at the time, but that did not deter Dean whatsoever. And the day we met, she called a friend of hers who lived in Denver and said, "I just met the man that I want to spend the rest of my life with." So in other words, there was something about me that she saw, because we didn't talk that long that first day. But then over the years she said that I reminded her of Pappy, meaning William Faulker, her uncle, whom she called Pappy. And in fact, all the children in Oxford called him Pappy. He was very accessible and he loved children. But she never told me that, and I had to find out that she had said that to her friend Sandra Baker, who grew up next door to Roanoke, by the way. 2 weeks after Dean had passed, in 2011, Sandra emailed me and said, "I've been meaning to tell you." So I didn't know that all those years. Now there is in the kitchen in Miss Maud Faulkner's house where we live, Miss Maud, William's mother, a sign over the kitchen door that says, "Don't complain, don't explain." Now Dean took that to heart because she never explained to me or told me that she had, for her it was love at first sight, and I had no idea. And so that's where we met.
You have a lot of detail and dialogue in the book. Did you keep a journal, or do you have a fantastic memory?
I had an email from Alan Greenblatt, who is an NPR reporter. He was at Square Books about a month ago, and he picked up my book and he read it, and he said, "I love the specificity in this book," meaning the detail. He said, usually memoir is this happened and this happened and this happened and la-di-da. And he said, but yours is about real people having real experiences. Well, I started writing this book, this memoir, a couple of weeks after Dean passed. It was my grief therapy. And the first thing I realized was that I had written it before when we were in graduate school in 1973 and 74. And I started looking for that manuscript. And I found it in a closet. It was 200 pages. And that was my start, see. And I went to a friend of mine who was a lawyer and whose family's from Fort Gibson. And Tom had one of those early scanner machines. He was an attorney, so he had to get a legal document scanned and then rewrite them or whatever. And he was able to scan that and save it as a Word document. And so I was off and running, and I had written that when everything was happening. It was all fresh to me. You haven't read the book yet, but there's a scene in it in which Dean's mother, Louise, was opposed to our getting married, not because she didn't approve of me, but because, and she was the wife and the widow of Dean Faulkner, Dean's father, Dean Swift Faulkner. He was an airline, he was a barnstorming pilot who was killed in a plane crash near Pontotoc in 1935, 4 months before Dean was born. Now I've lost my train of thought. Sorry.
I asked you to pick a journal.
Oh, of course. Okay, so I wrote this first as a novel, and it had scenes in it like when her mother, when I first met her mother, her mother was very caustic and was in her cups, and I had all that dialogue verbatim that happened in 1972 and 73, and it's because I wrote it in 1974. So that's my substitute.
You were headed for an academic career, getting your doctorate in English. You had taught in higher ed, and all of a sudden you pivoted and became a publisher. How did that come about?
She's talking about Natale Press.
Hey, I wasn't going to pronounce it.
Oh, you didn't want to pronounce Natale. Well, that is Faulkner's curse on the reading public. Nobody can pronounce it. I like what Eudora Welty would say. She would say, "I'm a Natale fanatic."
How did you become a publisher?
Okay, Natale. Sorry. Howard Duvall, who was a businessman in Oxford, started Natale Press in 1975, and he reproduced Faulkner's first book, Marionettes, in facsimile. It's just beautiful, and Ben Wasson wrote the introduction. In 1976, Howard began to court me to edit the Cofield collection, which was the pictures of J.R. Cofield, who was William Faulkner's family photographer. And he had a studio in Oxford, and I knew Mr. Cofield, and I'd been over to the studio. His son, Jack, Mr. Cofield was dead at that point, and his son, Jack, wanted to publish the pictures. But Jack wanted to do a scrapbook that his father had put together, and I wanted to make it a full photobiography of the narrative of Faulkner's life and his work. But to do that, we had to find the pictures. Well, Jack only had the studio portraits for the most part, and Faulkner did 6 sittings at his studio. But Dean, my wife, had a Faulkner photo collection. Her grandmother was a photographer, and she had a fabulous collection of at least 150 pictures. So that's how I got in. I backed into the publishing business. I was teaching at Northwest Community College at the time, and I had finished my doctorate. So the Cofield collection became my baptism into Faulkner lore and Faulkner scholarship. Howard, we brought out the book in 1978, the Cofield collection. I don't know if you've seen that. I just published a reprint, a paperback last year, and it's on our website is youngnatalepress.com. But anyway, the Natale Press really took off when Willie Morris came to Oxford in 1980, and that's another story.
Was Oxford still Faulkner's town when you arrived?
Faulkner's town, yes it was, very much so, because was still looked the same in 1970. Faulkner had been dead 8 years. I never met him. After Dean and I were married, I was a pallbearer at his wife Estelle's funeral, and I was a pallbearer at his brother Jack's funeral, and also at his stepson Malcolm Franklin's funeral. But the Faulkner family, the town of Oxford really was stunned at Faulkner's passing, and they didn't know how to deal with his legacy, and they sort of looked to the Faulkner family for guidance. But Jill moved away; she moved to Charlottesville. That was his daughter. So the first step was what would happen to Roanoke. And to everybody's horror, in Oxford, everybody who knew what was going on, the University of Texas offered Jill $500,000 for the house if they could move it to Austin. And the joke was, I don't think this could be true, was that they wanted to dig up the cedar trees and move them too. And you know, the University of Texas has a wonderful humanities resource center, which is full of great scholarship, and they have a big Faulkner collection. And with all that oil money, they were ready to do that in 1972 or 70. And Jill was wise enough not to sell it to the University of Texas, and instead sell it to the University of Mississippi, where it properly belonged. And Ole Miss has done a great job of growing up over the years. And then when John Grisham headed a fundraising to create a foundation, they raised $5 million almost overnight. Barksdale's contributed to that.
But Larry, you talk about in the book how not everyone in town was a fan of Faulkner. I think there's one story where you went to Mr. Varner's store.
Yeah. I was a graduate student, and I took my typewriter to be repaired at Mr. Varner's repair shop. And I couldn't resist saying to him, he had an arm missing. He repaired all those typewriters with one hand. And he was really good at it. He was the only guy in town, really, with all the Ole Miss students and faculty. And I told him that Faulkner had a character named Varner, Will Varner, who owned Frenchman's Bend and all the property around it, and he was an attorney also. And he spat on the floor and said, "I wouldn't cross the street to speak to that fellow." So that was my first personal reaction from a person in town, that they really despised Faulkner's work. But there were plenty of people who were shocked by Sanctuary and couldn't understand the sound of the fury. They didn't like the idea of As LA dying and the stinking coffin being moved all the way from near Frenchman's Bend. And Miss Mullet, his mother, was at a bridge game one day and with her bridge club. And one of the ladies said, "Mullet, why did Billy write that book?" And she was talking about Sanctuary. And everybody knew who Temple Drake was, by the way. She was a judge's daughter, and she was a flapper. And Faulkner captured her perfectly. So there's a lot of gossip going around about Sanctuary. Miss Mullen put down her cards and said, "My Billy writes what he has to." Because he wrote that book to make money, and he was at a crucial point in his life. His books weren't selling, and Sanctuary made money. And he paid off his initial investment in Roanoke with that money. But that was my Mr. Varner experience.
Yes, but you also had an interesting introduction to the Faulkner family when you went to the airport.
Oh, I met his stepdaughter, Chocha, William's stepdaughter, Chocha. And Dean had said that I had to take her relatives with a grain of salt and not to worry about them and not to worry about what they were exactly, their characters. What I came to understand was that there was this competitiveness among the members of her generation. They were all first cousins. There weren't many of them. And after we were married, I was surprised that they didn't get together for Christmas or Thanksgiving. There was never any intermingling with them. And the men in the family believed in primogeniture, and they were in charge. And Dean, though, was emerging as the spokesperson because of her eloquence. And people went to her and wanted her to help supervise and arrange anniversaries or Ole Miss was slow in coming to the Faulker conference. But when they finally started that, Dean was invited to be on a panel that first day. It was in Bishop Hall. And she had a fear of public speaking, like her uncle who whispered his Nobel Prize speech, one of the greatest speeches ever written. I think that was when she developed her fear of public speaking. But that day in Bishop Hall, she emerged as the spokesperson for the family, and she was witty, charming, fun, funny, and she always told the truth. She had this innate strength of character about Dean, and people really relied on that from her. One time we went to Little Rock and went out with Charles Portis, Buddy Portis, they call him, and Dee Brown, who wrote "Bury My Heart at Windy Dee Brown." And they said, "Oh, here come the Mississippi ambassadors." And that was how Dean was viewed, that she was an ambassador for her uncle's work and also for Oxford. We were, and Yakima Press had a little to do with that, because when Willie Morris came in, we published 5 books by Willie. Yakima Press was all over the state promoting his books.
Wasn't you and Dean played a significant part in Oxford becoming a literary community with many people who came to visit at your home, and in your work to bring Willie Morris to Oxford as the first professional in residence. Tell us about how that experience played out in its impact on Oxford.
Okay, Willie remade Oxford in his own image, let's put it that way. He came in, we met him at Bill and Mary Jane Whittington's house in Greenwood. They gave a party for Willie because he was a guest speaker at the Greenwood Arts Festival in 1978. And the first person I saw when I went in their house was Vern Keating. And I had just written, Vern wrote for Airline Magazine, as you know. And I had just written a story about Dean and me going up in a balloon at the 4th of July in Oxford in 1976, the bicentennial celebration. And that story is the first chapter in this book. And I hired a photographer to take our pictures. We went up in the balloon, and the balloon was not helping us. The balloon was flown by a guy from Greenwood who was a crop duster, and he also was a balloonist. And at the last minute, a puff of wind turned the balloon around, and the photographer only had 1 second to take that picture, and Dean waved. I said, "Wave," and she waved at the camera and flashed that great smile of hers, and it was the cover picture that I showed to Vern Keating that night, and he went, "Oh no, now I've got to look over my shoulder, you're coming up behind me." But Willie took an instant liking to us. That if a writer's going to like you, he will never, ever stop liking you. do something terrible to you. So Willie, his first words to us, we went out on the lawn there, and we went over to the outdoor bar. And he said, "Would you stand between me and those little blue-haired ladies? They're looking at me like they're getting ready to ask me to address their book club." And he said, "I cannot say no to ladies of my mother's generation." And we didn't know it then, but we were getting ready to be Willie's handlers. And he was asking about Oxford. And his first question was, "How many bars do you have?" And we had one, but it was really a half of a bar. It was so tiny. It was in the Holiday Inn. And the restaurants all closed. It stopped serving at 9 or 9:30. And Willie was worried that he couldn't stand the pace in Oxford if he came back. But he let us know that he was interested in teaching at Ole Miss, and he asked us if we would speak to Porter Fortune, the chancellor. And we did that when we got home, and from the Greenwood Arts Festival. And Porter Fortune was thrilled that Willie wanted. Ole Miss had never had a writer in residence, and William had been asked to address one class in 1948. And he was reluctant to do so. Do you know the story about Faulker in the classroom? He said, I will speak to the class. It was just an English class, a literature class. If there will be no reporters present, then I can say what I want to without being quoted, fear of being quoted. And there was this AP stringer was in the room, and the teacher didn't know that this kid was stringing for the AP. He actually worked for the athletic department. And they said, who are the top writers in America? And he named 4 writers: John Dos Passos, Thomas Wolfe, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Willard Haytham. And he said, and myself, I belong in the top 5. And the kid raised his hand and said, "What about Hemingway?" And Faulkner said, "Well, he plays his cards too close to his vest." And what he meant by that was he didn't challenge the reader. He wrote simply. Hemingway writes a section of description and then a section of dialogue. It's just back and forth dialogue. If you think about it, all his books read like movie scripts. And he did that on purpose, and it vaulted him into the spotlight as a great writer that everybody wanted to read. The AP stringer changes what Faulkner said, and he said, his headline was, "Faulkner says Hemingway lacks courage." And it was published in every newspaper just about in the world, and Hemingway read it in Havana a couple of days later in the Havana paper. And I wish I knew the Spanish for it, but Faulkner says Hemingway lacks courage, and Hemingway then writes a brigadier general with whom he had served in France during World War II when he was a war correspondent, to write Faulkner and attest to his courage under fire. Now Faulkner is really embarrassed. So this is Faulkner's one, and of course Faulkner never went back out to the camps, never spoke in another class after that. And he never forgot when something like that happened. So when Willie came, Faulkner had, of course, it was 1980 when Willie came to Oxford, and Faulkner had been gone for 18 years. And the town was waiting to lavish their affection on a writer because they had been denied. When Faulkner won the Nobel Prize, the town realized they had sort of missed the boat with him. They hadn't supported him the way they should have. And he resented it. And so they never knew how to handle him. And many times when he'd be walking around town, he was thinking of his characters. He was thinking of a story he had written, and he would pass people without speaking to them. And they thought he snubbed them on purpose. But of course, that wasn't true. If they had spoken to him, I'm sure he would have spoken back. But they didn't know how to handle him. But Willie was a social animal. He loved being with people. He'd grown up in Yazoo City, as you know, and was writing a column for the high school paper when he was 12 or 13. And so Willie received all of that held back affection that the town had waited to show to a writer. And he was an instant big hit. The students were running across the campus to get to his class. I'd never seen anything like that. So Willie started really, I think, Oxford on the way to its second Renaissance.
Why don't you tell us about Willie's book, The Courting of Marcus Dupree, and how did that come about?
Well, do you know the book, The Courting of Marcus Dupree by William Morris? It's about the high school running back, Marcus Dupree in Philadelphia. Willie was in a mild depression when David Halberstam came to Oxford to see him, to visit him. Now, Halberstam had gone to Harvard, and when Halberstam graduated, I'm going to guess it was around 1955, the only job, he had been offered a job at the Clarion Ledger. And I don't know what the connection was, somebody at Harvard. And when he got to Jackson, they said, well, that job has been filled, but let me get on the telephone and see if I can find you something. And he called the West Point Daily Times leader, and they said, yeah, we can use him. We can use him. So he gets over there, and he had a great career there for maybe 2 or 3 years. It was a great place for him to start, and he loved it. But 30 years later, he comes back for his, they're having a celebration, and Halberstam came and he spoke. So when he came to Oxford, he told Willie, everybody down there in West Point is talking about this running back at Philadelphia. That's what the news is there. And Willie was not in the best of spirits because James Dickey had been there the weekend before, and we had taken James Dickey out to dinner. And he starts complaining to Willie about, he said, Willie, you're living the high life, but you're not getting anything done. It's time for you to get to work and write another book. What are you working on? And Willie took offense at that. And but Dickey had done his job, which was to get Willie cranked up again, because Willie had reached one of those points where he was having writer's block. But Halberstam brought him out of that. And when we were on the way to Memphis, I drove Halberstam to the airport. You know that Halberstam worked for Willie at Harper's Magazine. He was one of his top writers there. So they were old buddies. Willie was sitting in the back seat drinking beer. He never drank beer except when he was mad. He was drinking for breakfast. And he stayed up all night. And he was like Buddha in the back seat. And Halberstam and I were trying to think of a way to bring him out of it and get him interested. And we started talking about how Willie could write a great sports book about Marcus Dupree, because Marcus had brought the blacks and whites together in Philadelphia. They were cheering for him, and he was making the town, putting the town in the spotlight. And that was the town where the terrible murders had taken place, and the civil rights workers were killed, and the Ku Klux Klan involved. And so this was a chance for Willie to write about civil rights in Mississippi and its tortured history, and at the same time have a positive theme, a positive story to tell. And Willie is perking up in the back seat. And by the time we got to the airport, he was saying, how much can I get for an advance on this? And what do I have to, how much do I have to turn in? And Halberstam said, you can get $100,000 for a 2-page outline. And that's what he got. His agent was Sterling Lord, and Sterling got him $100,000. I sent Sterling, he asked me for 10 copies of Northward Home, which dropped it off the press that just reprinted. So I sent him 10 copies, and he sent those to 10 publishers, and he had a bidding war. And he just used Northrop Home as a sample of Willie's writing. One of the greatest books, in Southern literature. So Willie was that book. I have to tell one more story about that. When the book came out, Willie's had a Labrador Retriever named Pete, and he loved Pete. And Pete died. Willie called us at 2 in the morning and said, "Pete's lying outside, and he's sort of breathing, he's dying. My Petey, my Petey." And so we organized the Willie Altar Guild, and we put together a funeral for Pete, and the mayor, John Leslie, even though it's against the law in Mississippi to bury an animal, a pet, in the cemetery, he found a spot on a vacant corner of St. Peter's Cemetery in Oxford. I know where that spot is, and I'll show that to you when we take you on the tour. We buried Pete during it was drizzling rain, and Willie was sobbing the whole time, and I read, the dean picked out in the Episcopal prayer book, the burial for a small child, or an infant who has died in infancy without sin. And Pete had died without sin. So I read that, and Willie just sobbing, and one of the guys had made a little plywood coffin for Pete, and we buried Pete. So now we're afraid Willie's not going to finish his book, according to Marcus Dupree. And he holed up at the Holiday Inn, and he said, "I can't go back to the house." And Ed Perry, who was the Speaker of the House in the Mississippi Legislature, got him a deal for a cabin out at Sardis Reservoir, Sardis Lake. It's a state park, they had cabins. And Willie went out there and got to work and finish the book. But it was a year late. And so when the book came out, Marcus Dupree had run away from the University of Oklahoma because he had a fight with Barry Switzer, the coach. I don't know if you remember this. It was in all the news, all the newspapers, and the TV networks, the 3 main networks, carried that story every night for a week. Where is Marcus Dupree? Nobody knew where he was, but he was hiding out at Mississippi College in a dorm with one of his friends who was on the track team with him in Philadelphia. But all the reporters thought Willie knew where Marcus Dupree was, so they hung out at Willie's house on Faculty Road at Ole Miss. And I was over there, and as each reporter would come in, they would say, Where's Marcus, Willie? Do you know where he is?" And Willie would look at his bedroom door like that. And the guy would say, Can I go over there? And Willie would nod. And the guy would go over there, and all the other reporters were waiting for the punchline, because when the guy opened the door, there was nobody in the bed. Everybody burst out laughing. So Willie was in heaven there for 3 days. He stayed up all night. He was drinking a lot. 72 hours. He knew his book was going to be a bestseller because the publicity was stunning. Nobody gets that kind of publicity. Where is Marcus Dupree? And so he called his editor the next Monday after they found where Marcus was staying in it, and that was the end of that news cycle. And the editor said that she apologized. She was so sorry, Willie, that there was a glitch in our computer, and the book is still in the warehouse on Long Island. The book hadn't even gone out to the bookstores. It would have sold. They printed 40,000. They paid Willie $100,000 advance, printed 40,000 copies, and then didn't send them to the bookstores. And so Willie was pretty crestfallen about that, but he was philosophical also. But that was a wonderful period in Oxford when he was writing Recording of Marcus Dupree. everybody would get together with Willie. There was a coffee house called the Hoka, and he was asking people to come up with names of characters and people, and he had one of the oldest football coaches was his Deep Throat. He was giving him all the information on the bidding war for Marcus. It was a big bidding war with the colleges. The University of Oklahoma paid the most. 80,000 was what the rumor was. And Willie, the coach, his undercover coach, Willie said, Deep Throat is taking, what can I call him? And I said, how about Temple Drake? And if you'll go back and look at Mark's degree, that coach is called, Willie calls him Temple Drake. So that was really fun. I mean, Willie, that's the sort of thing that Willie brought to Oxford, that kind of drama, that kind of excitement, and everybody wanted Willie at their table, in the restaurants. It was an exciting time. He was there from 1980 to 1990, and then he moved to Jackson and married Joanne Pritchard. Yeah.
So among other people, literary giants, Larry also occasionally played host to a musical giant, Jimmy Buffett.
Oh, yeah.
It's my favorite story.
I got to play with Jimmy one night. I played bass in the Ole Miss Symphony, string bass upright, and Jimmy Buffett came to a Faulker conference, and Barry Hanna was a little irritated when Barry was walking around Roanoke at the Faulkner conference wearing a T-shirt that said "Read Living Writers." You know, they were all there to praise Faulkner, and Barry was down there with his T-shirt, and Jimmy walks down there, and all the Faulkner scholars surrounded him asking for his autograph. And Jimmy was embarrassed because he wanted to just go there as a Faulkner fan. And we were giving a little party. Dean and I started the Bo Faulkner contest, and for 16 years, Bo Faulkner parodies where the winner was published in the APs, sold that to 100 newspapers around the world. The winning parody, winning essay, they imitated Faulkner's style. They all were humorous. And so we were giving a Bo Faulkner party for the winner that year. And I think the year would have been around 2001 maybe. No, it had to be earlier than that because Willie was still there and Barry was still there. So it was in the 1989. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Sims Luckett from Clarksdale. Sims is kin to Bill Luckett, the mayor. Sims was there. And Sims was famous at Ole Miss for having been the oldest undergraduate. He was there for 13 years. I don't think that graduated him. He didn't want to leave Ole Miss. He liked to hang out at the frat and go to the football games. So Sims is there, and Barry got really jealous of Jimmy. And he got up and left, and somebody said, Barry is jealous of Jimmy. And Willie Morris said, no, he's jealous of Sims Luckett. Just, that was typical Willie wit. But Barry, Jimmy Buffett started singing after the party moved to the living room, and Jimmy serenaded Dean's teenage daughters with Margarita. And I ran and got him my guitar, and then I ran and got my bass and played with him, and then the whole party moved back to the kitchen. Jimmy introduced Dean to his mother, Pete's, and they became soul sisters. They were best friends. And Pete's helped Dean with one of her big problems of being Faulkner's niece. And it was, do people like me because of me or because I'm being Faulkner's niece? That was a big problem for her all her life. And Pete said, you can't change who you are, so just go with the flow. And that was her philosophy of life. And Dean had asked her how she dealt with it being Jimmy's mother. And that was a great gift that Pete gave to Dean, and Dean absolutely adored her. And we saw her a lot. She came up for everything in Oxford. The going on and weddings and funerals. But one of the funny things I'll share with you, I don't think Pete's would lie. Jimmy had a lot of girlfriends that were temporary for him, if you know what I mean. And so they thought it was going to be, is it okay for me to tell this story? They thought it was going to be a lasting relationship. And Jimmy had given them a house, his parents a house in Daphne, which is across the bay from Mobile. And a beautiful home. And so these, the lovelorn girls would come there and see Pete, and Pete felt that she wanted them to feel that there had been something meaningful. And so she began having little gatherings for them, and here they came, and they were like, it was like a little knitting circle, and I called it Pete's Buffett's Lonely Horse Club. And but it did some good. I mean, it helped these girls, and of course they went on with their lives and got married and so forth. And Jimmy never saw them again, and he knew this was going on, that his mother was doing this. It was okay with him. He didn't care. But the Buffetts were great friends of ours, and we, Kathleen, can I tell them about Escape to Margaritaville? Jimmy had a play, Escape to Margaritaville, that was on Broadway 3 years ago. Was it 3 or 4 years ago?
Pre-COVID, whatever that was.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I'm being self-indulgent here. I'm sorry I'm telling this story. But it's very quick, very short story. Jimmy gave us tickets near the front row, right in the middle. And it was a preview showing. The play didn't open until the next night, so this was with the critics. And Kathleen and I sit there, there's a wedding scene at the end, and the young groomsman runs up to the bridegroom runs up to the front of the stage, and he shoots the blue garter into the audience, and it hit me right here. And Kathleen was dying laughing. We're not married, but we are together.
I asked him if he knew what that meant. He goes, no.
I lied.
So,
Anyway,
yeah.
that's the Jimmy Buffett.
Okay, I was going to ask you, perhaps you've been standing there for a long time, and one overreaching question. The title of the book is In Faulkner's Shadow. Was it a heavy burden or a motivating burden or challenge?
In Faulkner's Shadow?
Being in Faulkner's shadow.
Oh, well, I think that it's, this is true of all the writers in Oxford, but really it's true of all writers everywhere in America. I think that we learn from Faulkner, we learn what we can take away from Faulkner, but our admiration for him is complete. It never wavers, and the writers in Oxford, we've got 24 published writers now or more, and they're flourishing in Faulkner's Shadow.
That's a good thing.
Okay, so I see now that I'm doing what I do a lot of times at programs. I've run over my time here. So we want to show you the film. It's 25 minutes, and we've still got time for that. The film is called Thinking of Home, Faulkner and Roanoke. And Kathleen is the producer. She produced it for the journalism school. They copyrighted it for the journalism school at Ole Miss. She got a $2,000 grant from Mississippi Film Alliance to make this. And she pestered me into doing this show and giving a tour of Miss Maud's house because we were afraid that the house would be changed by these children and it wouldn't look the way it did when Maud lived there and when Dean lived there. So I gave in, and it is.
And I also wanted to get on record all of the stories that Larry tells, because as you can tell, he's a great storyteller, and we needed to get this stuff down for posterity also. And Faulkner House is not open to the public, though every once in a while we do get knocks on the door. Is the house open? No. I need 24 hours to clean, thank you very much.
Roanoke in Oxford, Mississippi is the home of author William Faulkner, who lived here from 1930 until his death in 1962. Roanoke is owned by the University of Mississippi and is open to visitors from around the world. Faulkner's writings were inspired by local stories of Indians, runaway slaves, and matrons in the South torn between traditional ways and modern development. This is where he set short stories and novels to paper, ultimately winning the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1949. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award in 1954. William Faulkner remains one of the most celebrated and studied authors in the world. Whenever Faulkner spoke of home, he was thinking of Roanoke, and also his mother's home in Oxford, Mississippi, known as the Faulkner House.
My name is Larry Wells. I met my future wife, Dean Faulkner, in graduate school in 1970 at the University of Mississippi. We were both pursuing degrees in English. She was the niece of William Faulkner. We were married in 1972, and I moved in with her at Miss Maud's home. Maud Faulkner was Dean's grandmother, whom she called Nanny. The house was built in 1931. Miss Maud saw an advertisement in a magazine for a British captain's cottage, a house that's very common in England. The house was built by a crew that included her son, Maud's son, Dean Swift Faulkner, my wife's father. He was 22 years old and had just graduated from Ole Miss. He had never worked as a hod carrier before and unfortunately dropped some bricks on a fellow worker and was summarily dismissed. The house features a porthole over the door, a captain's ship's lantern next to the door. The front of the house is distinguished by a double sidewalk, which J.W.T. Faulkner, William's grandfather, built in 1902 so William and his brothers could learn to roller skate. At the time, it was the only paved sidewalk in Oxford. J.W.T. was the son of William C. Faulkner of Ripley, Mississippi, William's great-grandfather. He owned this square block where William's parents, Murray and Maud, built their home. J.W.T. Faulkner, the young colonel, had the Faulkner name engraved in concrete at the gate stone. Letters made of wooden forms were pressed into wet concrete and left there overnight. Apparently, one of the workmen didn't notice that he put an N in backwards. I like to think of William growing up. He would have been about 5 years old when this happened, and he saw that backwards N for the rest of his life, always stopping to look at it. It was a landmark for him. When he wrote his first book, Marionettes, he wrote the N backwards. I think he was very visual about his writing, and it may have started with the young colonel's gate stone. This house was Miss Maud's dream house. The family had lived in various houses in Oxford, I think 4 or 5. Everything in the house was exactly as she wanted it. The living room with its mantle that came from the old colonel's house, and the mirror over it, the French doors that she added. Maybe they were in the house plans, but I don't think so. The original furnishings were family furniture. A sofa, for example, and a love seat from the old colonel's home in Ripley. Things passed down from the Faulkners. But Maud hung her mother's painting, The Corn Still Life, in her living room and kept it always on display. Her defining presence is in this house and will always be. Her spirit can be felt in the architecture, designs, and furnishings. This bedroom was originally Dean's father's bedroom. Now it's my study. My favorite painting is the one of William Faulkner when he was 6 years old. You'll notice he has on a tie, and I think that was because the photo from which the painting was made was taken on Easter Sunday. This painting is framed in a collage. There's an old wrapper of William Faulkner from a French edition by the Minotaur Press. The painting's over the piano. The one on the left, a Chinese mask, which Maud painted probably as a study. The one in the middle is of Dean at age 2. You can see from this painting how Maud adored her. She was a living representative of her father. Dean was Miss Maud's 4th child and the first to die. He was only 28. As Dean said in her autobiography, Every Day by the Sun, I was the second coming. That put a lot of responsibility on Dean, both pressure and an honor. The paintings over the French doors are 2 landscapes by Maud. The one on the left is of her house on South 11th Street, and the nurse holding the baby is Caroline Barr, known affectionately as Mammy Callie. The baby she's holding would be Dean, the last Faulkner infant that Mammy Callie nursed. The little girl standing next to her is Jill, William's daughter. The Victorian house is where the Faulkner brothers grew up. They all had ponies. There's a big lawn in front of the house where they would ride. Over the French doors near the hallway, the one in the middle is the Witch of Harlem. Maud probably was drawn to that picture not only because she liked the emotion and fierceness of the witch, but maybe the witch reminded her of someone she knew, perhaps someone in her bridge club, who knows. One of the features of this hallway is the chain latch to the attic. There's a tradition in the family that as soon as you were able to touch this ring, you would reach up and hit it and make it swing. And when we were raising the children, I don't know if that chain ever stopped moving. It was almost as if they were born to make it swing. Dean and I were standing in the hallway one day, and she said, "Come here, Nanny is with us." I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "She always comes to me as the smell of lilac talcum." And that's what I smelled when I stepped into the same spot. When I stepped back, I couldn't smell the talcum. When I stepped forward, there it was. The impression was that Miss Maud was paying us a visit. You had to be in that same spot in the hallway to detect the talcum, and she came on several occasions. This house has a living presence of the past. It's not just the sense of ghostly presences, it's a family closeness that Miss Maud created. William would walk up from Roanoke virtually every day and sit on the front porch with her. His father died in 1932 and his mother lived alone. They would discuss maybe his latest short story. He might say, "I invented a character today. I call him V.K. Ratliff. I think you're going to like him." It's just this family has a sense of destiny about it. When William's brother Dean was killed, William brought Dean's widow Louise home to take care of her. The whole family was devastated by Dean's death, and Louise was 5 months pregnant with her child Dean, who never knew her father. She was born after he died. Her father was a barnstorming pilot who was killed during an air show in Pontotoc, Mississippi. He was flying a plane which William had given him, and William felt not only grief, but guilt. He felt a great responsibility for Louise. He put up a cot over by this window, a little army cot, and slept there for 10 days taking care of her. Then, as fate would have it, the galley proofs for his novel Absalom, Absalom arrived. He then began to work on the book, probably was relieved he had something to do other than grieve, and he finished the galley proofs of Absalom, Absalom while tending to Louise's every need and comforting her. This table is known as the Absalom table. The dining room has other tales to tell. One of them has to do with this sideboard, which came from the home of William Clark Faulkner in Ripley, Mississippi. He was William Faulkner's great-grandfather, and he won this silver tea set in a poker game in New Orleans. And because he had friendly relations with a certain lady in the French Quarter, when his wife found out about it, he hastened home to Ripley and gave his wife this silver tea service along with a 2.5-carat diamond ring, which he won in that same poker game. Because Miss Maud was 4'8", all the sinks in the house are lower than they are in other houses, and all the light switches are where she could reach them. Dean inherited these kitchen chairs from her Hale grandparents. This is one of Dean's favorite pieces. It's a Hoosier cabinet, but her term for it was Nanny's kitchen safe. This picture of Dean was taken at Roanoke in 1977 when she was filming an interview for William Faulkner, A Life on Paper, a documentary of Faulkner's life. This collage is from Homecomings, a book of Willie Morris's essays and Bill Dunlap's paintings. The baseball glove was a birthday gift from Dean's son John, reminiscent of her father, who played second base for Ole Miss in 1930 and 31. The sign over the door is a clue to understanding the Faulkners. Don't complain, don't explain was Miss Maud's favorite maxim, her philosophy of life, and it led to many problems because nobody knew what she was thinking. She didn't complain, and she didn't explain. The whole family took this to heart, and a lack of communication ensued, I must say. I've seen Dean's children jump up and tap that sign as they went through the door. This phone doesn't work anymore, but we've kept it as a reminder of when lightning struck the house. In 1976, Oxford had a lightning storm where there were 39 recorded lightning strikes in 2 minutes. 8 houses were simultaneously set on fire. Dean was talking on the phone. Dean said, "Wonderful," and at that moment the lightning struck, and the phone receiver vibrated so violently it knocked her down. I went and picked her up, and we immediately heard thunder, the lights went out, and we could smell smoke. The roof was burning. The first fireman on the scene was Larry Brown, later to become a novelist. Dean's first words to him were, "What kept you?" He got here in 30 seconds, I think. Anyway, the fire department and Larry Brown saved this house from burning. The back porch contains mostly family photos. This picture of Willie Morris and Dean and myself at a football game in Alcorn, Mississippi. It was 1994, I believe. That was the last time that we were on a road trip with Willie Morris. In 1988, Dean and I had Faulkner House listed on the State and National Historic Register. The house is important not just because William Faulkner's mother lived here, or that he visited her on a weekly and almost daily basis, but because of his parents, Maud and Murray Faulkner, and what they meant to the town of Oxford. Murray was the business manager at the University of Mississippi for many years. Maud was a fierce and protective mother who loved her sons equally. It just happened that one of them was a future Nobel laureate of literature.
It is a place to make a pilgrimage to visit an author. That's how it used to be, just William Faulkner. But now, more than ever, the people are seeing it because it's just a chance to see an antebellum home and an antebellum landscape where a famous author lived. It speaks to everybody, it really does. Colonel Shegog built the house in 1844, and it's a half 2/2. One side of the house, the east side, has 2 rooms over 2 rooms. The other side of the house has 1 room over 1 room. And then it's squared off with porches, screened-in porches and sleeping porches. And that's how this house was built. There's 4 landscaped acres, and that's what the original purchase price came with. $6,000, 4 landscaped acres. And then later, there's an option on the 29 acres of woods. He told his wife he had a plan for restoration and to fix it, and he did. He wrote Sanctuary as a bestseller. It became a bestseller as he predicted it would, and he sold it to Hollywood and paid off the property and made it livable, and this is where they stayed the entire 32 years of their marriage. If I was going to pin down Roanoke as a person from the 30s, it's definitely William Faulkner. It's definitely Mr. and Mrs. Faulkner. I mean, those two probably have done more for the personality of the property than anything. Not just through what they did to the property, but also the things that they kept and restored. Faulkner didn't name the property until 1932. He named it after 2 trees, the rowan tree of Scotland and the live oak of America. Neither tree is on the property. It's named after the spirit of those 2 trees. The rowan tree in Faulkner's reality is supposed to keep out evil spirits like reporters and the taxman, and the live oak was for strength and solitude. Don't go looking for it because you're not going to find it. Instead, the whole property is Roanoke. The library was used for relaxation and socializing. It's a primary place William Faulkner worked during the first 20 years that he lived at Roanoke. It still contains about 80% of the original volumes. This is Faulkner's favorite chair for reading. The picture on the wall are of 4 generations of Faulkner men in Mississippi. They were all painted by Maud Faulkner. The old colonel moved from St. Genevieve, Missouri to Ripley, Mississippi. He took the U out of the name and made it F-A-L-K instead of F-A-U-L-K. During the Civil War, he raised his own regiment. After the war, he built a railroad, was a best-selling author, and a Mississippi business tycoon. The old colonel was shot down in the streets of Ripley after an election. Faulkner said he was killed in a duel, but by every other account, it seems he was flat out assassinated by a former business partner. The young colonel, William Faulkner's grandfather, started the First National Bank of Oxford. His son Murray had various businesses, but ended up as the business manager of the University of Mississippi. For a while, the family lived on campus. Maud painted this portrait of William when he became postmaster at the University of Mississippi. The painting was too short for the frame, so Maud added a piece of wood at the bottom and painted it to look like part of the painting. I think that is wonderful. She was very thrifty. William and Estelle knew each other since childhood. They were sweethearts. William Faulkner gave Estelle his family ring. Mr. Oldham, Estelle's father, explained to Estelle that her needs would be better met with an attorney rather than an unemployed poet. In 1919, she married a man named Cornell Franklin. They divorced in 1929, and William and Estelle married that same year. She brought her 2 children with her to the marriage. The new family moved to Roanoke in 1930. William and Estelle's first child, Alabama, was born in 1931. She was named after William Faulkner's favorite aunt. She was premature and survived only 9 days. William and Estelle had separate rooms. This was where William Faulkner recuperated from a binge, but it was also where the binges occurred. His original hunting camp was almost 2.5 hours away, just like in The Bear, except the hunting party has to go further and further to find the big woods. His last one was only 30 minutes away. The big woods shrank and shrank in Faulkner's lifetime. He remembered a time when they hunted bears in the Delta and when there were huge hard pines and giant oak trees. It was all cleared for cotton. Their second child, Jill, was born in 1933. Her room has been maintained much as it was when she lived here. Jill, like her father, loved horses. Jill told me the story that she was always introduced as Jill Faulkner, William Faulkner's daughter. When she met the man who later became her husband, he replied, "Pardon me, but who is William Faulkner?" She told me she thought to herself, "Well, that's the man for me." His office is the most interpreted and interesting room in the house. You can see on the wall an outline of his novel, A Fable, the first book he wrote after he was awarded the Nobel Prize. This story was initially assigned to him in Hollywood as a screenplay. Instead, he turned it into a novel. We have the letters written back and forth between the producer and William Faulkner. It is a very interesting story. His daughter Jill said that when he was writing, the typewriter and typewriter table were against the wall. Shortly before he died, he had fallen off of a horse. His injuries were painful and he couldn't get up and down the stairs easily. So they moved the bed down from upstairs. He had a big Royal typewriter and this Underwood portable typewriter. He took it everywhere with him. You can see it in photographs of him working outside. Every writer, it seems, had a portable typewriter.
In 1971, I had an opportunity to visit Roanoke with the Faulkner family before the house was sold to the university. When Vicky's husband, Jim Black, died, she arranged for his burial at St. Peter's Cemetery in Oxford. We entertained Vicky, her mother Cho-Cho, and Dean's mother Louise at Roanoke.
The children explored the house and tramped up and down these stairs. As we sat talking in the library, I became aware that this was the Roanoke that Dean and her relatives had known when William Faulkner was alive. Their laughter and ease of being made Roanoke seem less a literary landmark than a family home. 5 children grew up at Roanoke. William's daughter, Jill, his niece, Dean, his stepchildren, Cho-Cho and Malcolm, and a step-granddaughter, Vicky.
Meals in the Faulkner dining room were rather formal and came with rules. No telephone calls were allowed during the meal. In the fall of 1958, the phone rang, and Dean thought one of her friends was calling. She says, Pappy, please let me answer the phone." William relented, and she answered the telephone, which was in the pantry, the only phone in the house. The caller identifies himself. "This is Edward R. Murrah. May I speak with Mr. Faulkner?" Dean is thrilled. Murrah, of course, was a well-known CBS News journalist and radio host. She assumed Pappy would be excited to speak to him. William says, "What does he want?" Dean returned to the phone, now apprehensive that something was going wrong, and she said, "Mr. Faulkner wondered what is the reason for your call, Mr. Murrah." He says, "Pasternak won the Nobel Prize. We'd like a statement from Mr. Faulkner." Back she goes to the table. By now, she knows things are going wrong. "Pappy," she says, "it's about Pasternak winning the Nobel Prize. They want a statement." William replies, "Tell him it's a political hoax." Dean says, "Pappy?" He says, "Tell him what I said." She goes back to the phone and says, "Mr. Faulkner says that it was a political hoax." Murrah says, "Thank you," and hangs up. Dean took her seat and resumed eating. Nothing more was ever said about the phone call. He nurtured the children with stories, and one of his favorites and their favorites was the story of Judith, allegedly the daughter of Colonel Shegog, who built the house. According to Faulkner, she had fallen in love with a Union soldier during the Civil War. When he jilted her and went home to Ohio or wherever he lived, Judith came out on the balcony and threw herself off and broke her neck. This is fictional, remember. William is making up this story, and the girls are sitting at his knee, perhaps reminding him of any parts he had left out. Something about the tragic story satisfied their sense of finality. For Judith, there was no marry and live happily ever after. As far as they were concerned, the story was perfect the way it was. They would take their rag dolls and throw them off the balcony, argue about which one looked more dead than the others, run down the stairs, pick up the dead rag dolls, race back up the stairs. In the 1970s, I heard Dean telling the stories to her children and begged her to record them for posterity. They were eventually published in a book she called The Ghost of Roanoke, William Faulkner's Ghost Stories for Children. One night, the girls are awakened by the sound of the piano playing downstairs. Dean and Vicky sit bolt upright in the bed, look at each other, and say, "Judith." The music was Chopin's Minute Waltz, which they had all learned to play. Cho-Cho told them it was Judith's favorite. Jill comes out of her room, and Faulkner appears with a flashlight. Down the staircase he goes, followed by the three girls in their nightgowns. They're sure it's Judith at the piano. But when the flashlight beams reach the parlor, the music stops. The girls race past Pappy into the parlor, only to find it empty. They hurry to the front door, which is locked, then check the back door, which is also locked. Then they search the house, positive that Judith has paid them a visit. About that time, Cho-Cho comes out of hiding, and William did not tell them ever that it was Cho-Cho, his stepdaughter, who was playing the piano. It was a very elaborate prank, and he had sworn Cho-Cho to secrecy. But when Dean was married the first time in 1958, William Faulkner gave her away in marriage, and they dressed here for the wedding, and Dean came down the steps in her wedding gown. William was giving her away. He was in his mourning coat. The car was waiting outside. And Dean, being on the threshold between girlhood and adulthood, pauses at the door as they're going out, and she says, as the world awaited her and her future awaited her, "Pappy, there's just one thing I want to know. Was Judith real?" And he said, "You know, Dean, I made her up for you and the girls, but I believe in her, don't you?" And the essence of that is that his gift to them was storytelling and a gift of the imagination. And this house was a magical place for them as they grew up here. And they carried that magic with them throughout their lives.